Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of the Flutter tutorial where we'll start to use a REST API. So what is the problem we want to solve in this episode? We want to fetch data from a backend asynchronously, show it in a list, and in addition we want to implement pull to refresh, meaning if we pull it down we want to load the data again, and hence in terms of Riverpod, we need to watch this list of person objects. So first have a look at the REST API. I found this great tool where you can easily define a table with different columns, get some dummy data generated, and you may access this API through a permanent URL. And that's the first thing you should do after you defined and generated your API. Have a look at the data as it is returned by the server. So in this video, we want to show this data to the user. If we think of our simple layered architecture, that means in the domain layer, we need something that matches this JSON data to data as we may use it in our app. And in the data layer, we need to make this GET request to our API. In this context, there are two libraries widely used, and you should discuss in your team or with yourself if you want to do so. First, there's Dio, which makes many things easier, like request cancellation, timeout handling, and so on. So I strongly suggest this package. However, you can also go with the built-in HTTP package. If you use Dio, you should also go for the pretty Dio logger to get a nice logging. For the domain layer, you might use Freest. First, I didn't do so, but then I gave it a second thought because of two reasons. First, it's widely used and most likely you will find it in other repositories and projects. And second, as we use the Riverpod generator already and hence the build runner is running already, it's very easy to use Freest. On the const side, it generates most likely much more code than you really need. To be able to access the internet on mobile applications, you have to define the permissions. I followed the instructions and I tested it for Android. Unfortunately, I don't have access to Mac and hence I'm not able to test this part. So if you run into any problems here, please let me know, or even better, create a merge request with a fix. So let's start with the code. First thing, define some constants where to find your API. So later on, if you work with another API or if you work with another version of your API, you have one place to change it. Next, if you use Dio, I suggest you put it into the utils folder to configure it, because you might have more than one repository using it. We follow here the function notation of the Riverpod generator. So later on we have this available as Dio provider. In the next step, you should create your feature folder, which I simply called REST Quad Demo, with those subfolders for the data layer, for the domain layer, and for the presentation layer. We will start with the simplest layer, the domain layer, and we simply match the JSON object as it is to a Dart object. So we have an ID, a name, and an image URL. We have an ID, a name, and an image URL. We follow the instructions of Freest. That's all we have to do. Typically, you have a factory method from JSON. Be aware, it takes a map of string and object and returns a person object. That's all for the domain layer. For the repository, you should decide now if you want to follow a stream-based approach or a future-based approach. So streams are used if the backend or the access of the backend, the way you access the backend, handles data updates. So as the word stream says, you expect a stream of data and you can easily watch this stream and show the updated data in your UI. You find many tutorials for stream-based APIs, especially in combination with Firebase, as it is strongly suggested and supported by the Flutter team. For the backend we use, I think it's more appropriate to follow the future approach because we have a simple asynchronous request and we make pull on request, so it's not fetched automatically, but you need a user interaction to refresh the screen. So even if we watch this list of person objects, a refresh of the screen will be possible by calling invalidate on the according provider. But first we have to define the repository and we have to define the provider. So within our repository, we will define a function getPeople, which returns a future of list of person objects. And those person objects are the person objects of our domain layer. With you, it's very simple. You make a GET request. You may check for the return status code. On success, it's 200. And we expect some data, at least an empty list. And now we have to map the JSON data returned to a list of person objects. If we do not get a success status or if we do not get any data at all, we throw an API exception. And that's the next thing you should discuss in your team. How do you want to handle errors? In addition, you could wrap this part into a try-catch, because if anything goes wrong here, meaning if we do not get the JSON object as we expected, this will result in a separate exception, not of the type API exception. By the way, API exception is something I defined here. It holds the status code and a message. Now we want to define the provider for the repository. This makes testing and mocking our repositories easier later on. And in addition, we want to watch this list of person objects, and hence we define, using this function notation, a fetchPeople provider. This accesses the repository here and returns this future list of person objects. You could put those providers in a separate file. However, I found it easier to put the providers as I need them and define them in the same class which is related to them. So now let's have a look at the UI and how it's implemented. So here we have the list as it is shown here, and all the information we show is the name of the person. So we have a simple text widget with the name of the person and where do we get the people object from. That's where we use the async value widget. It's a widget defined in the folder common widgets, which handles the error and the loading state. So here we watch the fetchPeople provider, and in case of any changes, for example for arriving data, we have the data parameter where we get this list of person objects and we show it in the list. So we are able to show this list of people. The remaining problem is to implement a pull to refresh. That's very simple in Flutter. You simply have to use the refresh indicator, and all you have to do now is to invalidate the fetchPeople provider, invalidate, causing the state of the provider to be refreshed. According to this type definition, we need to return a future void, and we simply do so by following this syntax. So now we handled all the implementation needed to implement this part of the application. You may now be able to have a closer look how to handle errors. You can simply mimic a bad returned status code. So on a success, we expect 200, and I just put in a 210. You may add some breakpoints, for example here, here, and here. So we got an exception because the status code returned is 200, which is real success. So it throws the exception, hence this error part is active. We got a status error data, and now this error message widget will be shown, which is shown to the user. In addition, you should discuss how to handle network timeouts and how to define your network timeouts, and in addition, how to do canceling of requests. That's something which is implemented in this repository. That's all for now. In the next video, we want to add new data and change data. See you then. Bye-bye.